Well, during the war, first time I remember seeing my father was actually after the war just ended. He was in the German army, and apparently, based on his parents and their family, their family were industrialists, very wealthy industrialists, coming from the northern part of Germany. Don't know exactly what kind of business they were in, but it had to do with heavy equipment, whatever that meant. They were manufacturers. Manufacturers of what? Not exactly sure. But the first time I met him is when he was released from prison. He was a prisoner of war during the war, or toward the end of the war, and was released. He spent most of his time in Yugoslavia. He was highly decorated. Mostly for burning down villages and killing a lot of people. So he received the Iron Cross. And the first time I saw him, we were living in, not sure exactly what the name of the town was. It might have been Augsburg, although I really don't remember. And I saw this guy walking down the street in tattered army uniform. And he was walking toward me, and I kind of stopped what I was doing. Wasn't really doing very much. And as he got closer to me, I think I realized who he was and where he was going. And he gave me a hug. I think I hugged him back, I'm not sure. And I realized that, he was my father. And I remember looking at him and thinking how tattered he was, how tired looking he was. And I think he walked a long way to get to where we were. He finally found out where we were living, and he had a little rucksack on his back. And he kind of reached back into his rucksack and pulled out a present for me. And the present were actually a pair of slippers. They might even have been homemade. I don't think they were purchased in a store or anything, because there weren't any stores. So I don't know where he got it, but I remember being pleased by seeing the slippers, although I would probably have no use for them. Didn't wear slippers, walked around barefoot. Nobody really had slippers, as far as I could tell. I look if you had shoes. And I remember my uncle then coming down into the street and bringing my father up to the place where we were living, which was kind of a little hole in the wall apartment. And the next thing I knew, I was walking back toward the apartment, and there was a lot of yelling and screaming that I heard. And apparently my uncle and my father were engaged in a huge fight, physical fight. And next thing I remember was my father leaving. And he looked like he'd been pretty badly beaten up. My uncle was much larger than my father was. My father was not a big man at all. And I think being a POW really took a lot out of him, because he was close to skin and bones. I don't think he had much fight left in him. And so after he left, obviously Well, maybe not obvious, but I was crying. I was upset. I didn't really understand what the hell was going on, but I'm pretty sure that my mom put my uncle up to teaching my father a thing or two. And I think at the heart of it was basically that my father didn't have to be in a German army. He decided he wanted to be in a German army, perhaps because of his family and, their background. I'm really not sure. But I think the message to my father was, well, you left your wife and you left your kids, actually 2 kids, Edward, who was my older brother and mentally retarded, and me, to the mercies of the war because you saw yourself as some kind of a hero, defending Hitler and the fatherland. And so my father left very quietly, walked past me, kind of patting me on the head as he walked past, and that's really the last I ever saw of him. I think the meeting, if you can call it such, directly between my father and myself, lasted maybe a total of 3-4 minutes. That was pretty much it. He disappeared into the night. And I remember crying for the next couple of days. I really felt badly for him. I don't know what happened to the slippers. To this day, I'm not a fan of slippers at all. I walk around barefoot, but I appreciated the fact that he somehow got a pair of slippers for me. So that was pretty much it. He was in the German army, highly decorated for his exploits. And I always wondered what happened to the Iron Cross that he received. And finally I asked my mother what happened to it, and she told me that she had thrown it into the fireplace to burn it. She didn't want any part of it. She was an ardent anti-Nazi. My father wasn't a Nazi, to the best of my knowledge, but he certainly was a German soldier. And I think that's how she basically wanted her story to end, as she burned his Iron Cross because she had no use for him and whatever he believed in. After that, I don't know what happened to my dad. I never saw him again, although many years later we did hear from him indirectly, which I'll tell you in another segment of the story. And I remember then approaching my uncle, and I think I tried to hit him in defense of my father, although I'm not sure what exactly I was defending. But I didn't like the fact that he took it upon himself to punish my father for whatever misdeeds he might have been told my father did. So anyway, that's maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes tops of any relationship I had with my real father. He was just a regular soldier as far as I could tell. And I think a lot of the rationale for why he joined, I think, had to do with his family and a certain tradition where he came from. He was not in the SS, for sure. At least I'd like to think he wasn't. He was, and I have no reason to believe that he actually was. Just a regular German soldier, highly decorated. But my mother was a ardent anti-Nazi, and she would have none of it. I'm not sure. I think so. I think he was with a tank division, but I'm really not certain of it. But I found out much later that apparently he had been living with a Yugoslavian woman, and he wanted my mother to know that he made the trip up to see her and me. He didn't make the trip up to see my brother Edward. That became pretty clear to me even as a kid. But he wanted my mother to know that he was very happy with this Yugoslavian woman who treated him like a wife should, although he wasn't married to her. So that was kind of a tit for tat. And I finally realized, even at that young age, I don't think the two of them really got along. Perhaps ever. And somehow I found out later in life that my mother blamed him for my older brother being mentally retarded. Although what that connection could have been is beyond me, other than the fact that somehow the story came out that he beat her while she was pregnant, and the beating apparently caused brain damage to my older brother. I never believed that. I thought that was a made-up story. What's the difference between the two? Whether he gave her syphilis or whether he beat her when she was pregnant? Comes down to the same thing. Let's go with the syphilis story. That sounds pretty good, pretty sexy. And that's all I remember of my father. But in the next chapter, I'll tell you the next time we heard from him. Yeah, my mother was a fortune teller using cards. Whether she was making up people's fortunes all along, I couldn't tell you. But she continued to read cards for people ever since I can remember. She read cards during the war, after the war, and the stories that the cards told her were really, really interesting. Whether any of them were true or accurate, I really couldn't tell you. But she claimed that card reading kind of ran in the DNA of her family. Not my father's family, but her family. And whatever other skills she picked up came directly from the gypsies. Because she spent a lot of time, especially after the war, going into the woods and taking me with her into gypsy wagons. And they would read cards for her. She in turn would read cards for them. And they would tell her about her future and what the future had in store for her. And all of this was done very quietly. None of the neighbors knew that we were in the woods going into these gypsy wagons. I wasn't afraid doing it. And most of it occurred at night. As far as I could tell, the gypsies never really bothered us. We weren't supposed to be there. It was kind of unusual for non-gypsies to be in the presence of gypsies, but my mother felt very comfortable there. And I did too, and I was watching these magical acts of fortunes being told, all the time. I just kind of got used to it. And did I believe that they had these magical powers? Yeah, at the time I did. I don't believe it now, but I believed it then. And occasionally my mother would steal some food and bring it to the gypsies because they really had nothing to eat. But that was her way of compensating. I don't know what the gypsies gave her in return. Probably safe passage to and from the forest, but that's kind of what happened. I got used to being around gypsies. I thought they were an interesting group of people, but I remember them very well.
What did they look like?
They looked like circus wagons, like kind of like Conestoga wagons from our west, except they weren't off on angles. They were pretty straight up, and they were mostly made out of wood, very colorfully painted. Inside, they were not bare. A lot of rugs, a lot of tapestries. Very comfortable. And, not only were there adults, but there were kids. And they seemed harmless, if I could say that. They were really looked down upon by, regular people, worse than trash. Deriled, reviled. People would curse at them, spit at them if they ever came close to, civilized areas. I really couldn't understand any of that, why the gypsies were so hated. But, later in life, as I learned more about history, I finally figured out why they were so hated. And I won't get into that. History could tell its own stories about that. But I found them to be genuinely nice people. But then again, I was a kid. What the hell did I know? I know that they treated us very nicely. And they were kind to my mother. And my mother and the gypsies had a good relationship, very friendly, trusting relationship. Yeah, her mother was heavy into it, and that's where Grandma apparently picked up the skills. I don't know what skills are involved in reading cards, but I remember being a combination of regular cards and tarot cards. It was always a mystery to me, tarot cards anyway, but my mom definitely understood those cards. And even into her 90s, I continued to take her to have fortune told. Even to Rockland County in New York. When my mom would visit, I would bring her up on special occasions. She wanted to have her cards read. So there was a place just outside of Nanuet that I would take her to for card readers. We even took Carol Ann to the card readers. I have audio cassettes somewhere of some of the readings because we were allowed to record them. So my mother believed in it. Yeah, it's true. It's kind of like following, I guess, an entertainer. You had a fan club. And card readers, were ranked by by the people who had their fortunes read to them as to, who's the best, who's not, whose predictions came true. And so there was an actual ranking, believe it or not, among fortune tellers and card readers. I don't know what the rules were. I don't know what the competition was, but they apparently had an excellent reputation for reading cards. All I know is that she was really good at reading cards.
Yeah.
And even Mrs. Miller would have card readings done for her, by the prisoners, us. And I knew even back then as a kid, that was strange. I couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old when Mrs. Miller would ask my mother to read the cards for her. And I remember one particular sitting, my mom was reading cards for Mrs. Miller, and my mother started crying. And I don't remember how she actually got into it, but that's the point where she told Mrs. Miller that her husband and her 4 sons were not coming back from the war. And that's the point where I kind of got scared, because how would my mother know that? Well, it turned out it was true. They never came back. They were killed. And so that kind of forged a relationship between Mrs. Miller and my mother that I never really did understand until I was about 15 years old. And I'll tell you in another segment how that all came about. Well, that's really not totally true. The hospital was in place called Heidelberg. And it was high up. I think it was Heidelberg. I think. I'm pretty sure. But I could be wrong. Or it could have been Augsburg. I don't know. Those of you that watch this or listen to this at some point can figure out the geography. Wherever it was high up. And huge river running below. And the hospital looked more like a castle than anything else. And it was basically a recovery center for people who came down with tuberculosis. I don't know what the recovery rate was, but the reason my mother thought I was trying to escape, she was walking toward the hospital. She had been on a long train ride in an attempt to see me, the recovering patient. And I was really very anxious to see her, and I was kind of like leaning out the window. And the window was very high up from the ground. My mother, being my mother, panicked and thought that I was trying to escape the hospital. And I wasn't at all. And I thought she was just yelling and screaming because she thought I was going to fall out the window, which I wasn't. But back in those days, I really wasn't afraid of heights. I developed a fear of heights subsequent to that. But anyway, she finally got to the hospital yelling and screaming, and we hugged and all that kind of stuff. And I tried to assure her that I really wasn't trying to escape. Why would I want to escape? I mean, I was getting 3 meals a day, a lot of attention. I remember getting a hard-boiled egg in the morning. And that was the king's breakfast, let me tell you. And the only thing that I was really required to do was not run around, and made sure that I spent time in the chapel in the hospital. I'm not sure what the chapel had to do with the recovery rate, but I was required to be in the chapel for quite some time every day. So I was willing to comply because I really liked that egg in the morning, the hard-boiled egg. I remember putting a lot of salt on it. And not very many other people got hard-boiled eggs, so that's the story of the hospital. Yeah, different episode. One of my bunkmates and I decided, you know what, we could probably escape from the hospital. Not escape, that's the wrong word. Look and see what's around the hospital. So we figured, okay, let's tie some sheets together and we can probably crawl out, climb down the sheets, and let's explore. Because all we saw was the inside of the hospital. They never really let us out. Now we just wanted to see what was around there. It was more curiosity than it was an attempt to escape. And apparently that was reported to my mother in the hopes that she would talk to me and prevent future episodes such as this, because the hospital staff thought that it was an unsafe practice, which it probably was. So we never actually crawled out the window and down the sheets, but we were planning on doing it, for sure. I mean, how else would we know what was outside the hospital grounds?
Yeah.
It was fascinating. I can still see it. I can visualize it. And this was after the war, I think, because I can't imagine it being during the war. And the castle was famous because, again, it was very high up, very castle-looking, if that makes any sense to anybody. And apparently the king, I think his name was Ludwig, I think that was the king's name. Story with him was that apparently he was a little crazy. And the castle wasn't completely completed good portions of it were. Absolutely fascinating castle. It had gold gilding inside. There are multiple layers. Um, his wife, the queen, was apparently laid out in a coffin, and the coffin was there. And I remember looking at it. I'd never seen such wealth before. And then I heard the story of what happened to Ludwig. Apparently he went out on a rowboat because there was a lake nearby, or a river. I think it was a lake. You could see by looking at the castle. And strange thing happened. He apparently drowned somehow. He was removed from the boat, or he removed himself from the boat. The story was that they took him out. You know, somebody had to take him out because he was a little crazy. But so the story goes. I never knew him personally, so I couldn't tell you. But it was a really interesting story, really interesting visit. I don't think I've ever seen such wealth before. You know.
So do you remember the coffin? Do you remember that if it was glass or not?
You could look right through it. Yeah.
So you could see her in it.
Yeah, but remember, these are memories of a kid. So
that's what I'm. Yeah.
For all I know, it was a mummy in there made out of wax. I don't know, but allegedly that's where his wife was, and he loved her intensely. But you know, she's beautiful, beautiful face. And again, you know, I was very, very impressed. And I could still see it, what it looked like. Well, no, we went on other outings. Went to Switzerland.
Huh?
Went on one of those cable cars. Yeah. And that was interesting. I'd never, you know, seen anything like it before. I remember it was very cold. And we took a cable car ride, and I thought it was absolutely magical, you know, how people could envision or even build such things. Looking down, looking around. And again, now that I think back on it, I wasn't afraid. I'm terrified of heights now, but not back then. So they were interesting little excursions. But the castle is really what stuck in my head. Maybe partly due to the stories about the king and the queen. Maybe partly due to the fact that he drowned or was drowned. Not really sure, but the images of what was inside that castle were really seared in my brain. No. Interesting story. When the Russians came and bombed, we maybe had a one-day advance notice that the Russians were invading. And so very good friends of my mother and my father. My father was already gone into the German army. So my mother was left just with my older brother and myself and my Aunt Wally. And so my mother and these next door neighbors made a pact. And the pact essentially was they had a truck. And so they were going to take us in a truck with them so that we could escape the bombing of the Russians. And I think war does strange things to people, and fright does strange things to people, and panic does strange things to people. And instead of the truck being there, our good neighbors and friends decided to spirit themselves out in the middle of the night and not take us with them. And so I remember, even as a child, my mother being totally devastated by this. That how could they do that? They were lifelong friends. And so we were pretty much on our own. And so we left with the few belongings that we had. I think in rolled up bed sheets, you know, whatever my mother could carry. I couldn't carry much. I was just a kid. I think I was actually a baby. My older brother Edward really was not really capable of helping, but Steve was living there, my Uncle Steve. And for reasons that I've never understood, he decided that he wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to escape. He wanted to stay behind, together with my grandmother. And so my mother and Steve was her brother, they parted. Exactly how that parting took place, I don't really know. But Steve remained together with my grandmother. It's not that my mother wouldn't take them with her, because we had no idea where the hell we were going. But they decided to stay. And right afterwards, and after the war, somehow Steve and my grandmother wound up actually living in Poland. And Steve got a job working in a silk factory in Poland. He was the foreman, whatever that meant in terms of Polish silk factories. And that's where he remained. And in his mind, he renounced being of Lithuanian birth and decided he was Polish. And anybody who told him anything otherwise, well, he would give them comeuppance. And throughout the rest of his life, he was Polish. He declared himself to be Polish. Why? I don't know. Because Poland and Lithuania, through centuries, were at odds with one another, killing one another, and claiming they invented this, and the other country saying, no, we invented this. So I don't really get it. But yeah, he became Polish. And so the family was split. There were the Lithuanians, then there were the Polish people. And my uncle represented the Polish people. To this day, I can't figure out why he thought he was Polish, but I would let him think he was Polish. It was all right. My mother spoke Polish. Even Eddie spoke Polish. I didn't speak Polish. It turned out my mother spoke 7 foreign languages. Edward spoke probably about 6, even though he's mentally retarded. But he spoke a lot more languages than I ever did. So, and apparently I found out later it really wasn't that unusual for people from Europe to be multilingual. That's just the way you survived. And we eventually brought my grandmother over and Uncle Steve over from Poland. Flew them over. And that's time for another story.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah. So, there's a couple of more vignettes I've got in my memory bank. I don't know how this all fits together, but let me go back to Mrs. Miller, because that was a strange kind of relationship that was forged between Mrs. Miller and my mom, considering that we were really slave labor to her. And then her husband and her 4 sons got killed, and then the Russians came looking for us with the Americans, and Mrs. Miller took a risk of losing her life by hiding us. Because if she wasn't shot on the spot, and I don't think the Americans would have stopped the Russians, she certainly would have been sent to the gulags. So we were already in the United States, my mother and myself and Eddie. And my aunt had emigrated to Canada because my uncle had sponsored her and they got married. I was about 15 years old, and I think a sophomore in high school. And I wanted to become a U.S. citizen. Obviously, I was not a U.S. citizen, so I studied real hard for the test, the citizenship test. And so I became a citizen one day. I had to go to a courthouse in Brooklyn. And I remember a lot of foreign-looking people there with the little American flags, all proud to be part of the ceremony of becoming a citizen. And I kind of lost all interest, memory, in whatever happened to Mrs. Miller. And so that night, came home, and I asked my mother why she would put money into an envelope every week and send it to Mrs. Miller. I didn't get it. But that night I did. And so my mother explained to me that things are not always as they appear to be, and that people that you think are mean and cruel to you are not necessarily mean and cruel. All they're trying to do is protect the family and their own family, and that people do things that are not understandable at first. And I realized that what my mother was doing, and she could ill afford to do this, $5 a week doesn't sound like very much, but that's the amount. 5 single bills she would put into an envelope every week from her factory job. She worked in a Brooklyn fabric factory, Eagles Clothes. They used to make men's suits. And my mother was a master seamstress. Her specialty was making pockets. And for those of you that never sewed or don't know anything about sewing, making pockets for men's suits was pretty complicated. And my mother never used, any kind of paper modeling or anything like that. She did it all from her brain. And she would create the patterns for Eagles clothing. And as the story went on, my mother explained the risks that Mrs. Miller took in saving us, in that the money that she would send to Mrs. Miller every week was a pittance compared to the risks that Mrs. Miller took. And all along, I thought that Mrs. Miller was close to a monster, with the waterboarding, I call it waterboarding now, and all for a stupid chocolate bar. Well, it was important back in those days, I guess, that chocolate bar be preserved, and that was her daughter's only prized possession, and, maybe I ate it. Well, I didn't. I then began to understand that life has its own formula for equalizing things. Prisoners of war and slave labor then became the benefactors to the people that enslaved you. And that's really the wrong way to look at life, but you have to look at it from a human perspective. And I think I finally realized that it was my mother being human, Mrs. Miller being human, showing all of our flaws to one another, and kind of overcoming it in the end. I never did find out what happened to Mrs. Miller, nor her daughter. Maybe they're still alive, although I doubt it. It turned out they really weren't bad people at all. They were just simply trying to survive like the rest of us, except I didn't understand it back then. But I finally understood it. And that's the end of that story. She had her own tragedies, losing most of her family. We had our own, and maybe that's what kind of brought us together. I don't know. But wherever Mrs. Miller is, I wish her well. So, one of the other episodes that I remember was coming to live in Brooklyn. And I'd never been to school before. And I must have been, 45, got here in 46, got here in 49. I was probably 8 years old. And I had to attend school. And this was in Brooklyn. Not a good neighborhood. Directly underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. And PS7 was the school. So we had very few clothes that my mother managed to salvage, but she wanted to make certain that I went to school my first day properly dressed. And, we were no longer refugees. We made it. We were Americans, although we weren't citizens. We were living in Brooklyn. Wow. So my mother dressed me up. I remember short sleeve, white shirt, very long collar. I had on boots, came up knee high with the socks, and lederhosen. For those of you that don't know what lederhosen is, you should look it up on Google. They're basically short leather pants with suspenders, with floral design on them, in Brooklyn. So I get sent off to school, and I come back early from school. The kids just beat the living crap out of me and ruined my white shirt. The lederhosen was probably torn here and there. And I didn't have socks. I don't know what happened to my socks, but they got lost. And so some of the neighbors in Brooklyn saw me walking home and gathered around me and kind of brought me up to the little hovel that we were living in, which was the sponsor's apartment. People had sponsored us to come over and paid our way. By pay, I mean the guarantee that we wouldn't be burdens. So they finally convinced my mother that, Mrs. and Mrs., you can't send your child to school looking like that. And she tried to tell him that this was the finest dress, the money can buy. And she was reminded she's now in America, and wearing lederhosen was not ingratiating ourselves to the Americans. And so I remember one of our neighbors, he owned a candy store downstairs. He took me and bought me an outfit, an American outfit, whatever that means. And I didn't wear lederhosen ever again. Nor short sleeve white shirts. Never wore those either. And I remember the next day, I went back to school, fully Americanized. And the school was a very tall building. Well, same tall, but I was a kid, I was short. And they were playing this strange game up against one of the walls. And the game consisted of a bouncing ball. The ball was pink in color. I subsequently learned that it was a pinky. For those of you that don't know what a pinky is, to this day I'm not sure what it is. Apparently an American invention. And what you're supposed to do with a pinky is take a pin and put a hole or two in it so it wouldn't bounce so high. But they were playing what's called punch ball. And so one of the guys took pity on me and said, here, see what you can do. And the idea was to punch the ball and get the ball as high up on the wall as you could so it would hit the ball, come back down, bounce a couple of times, and then the next punch ball player would come up. So they gave me the pinky, and I still remember, the exploits of the day before when I was bloodied. And so I hit the ball. The ball went over the roof of the school. And I thought that I'd be arrested, sent to jail, whatever happens to people like me that lose a ball, an American ball. And so I panicked. And I decided that the best course for a guy like me to save my family was not to get them involved in any way, but to escape. And so I ran like hell back toward my neighborhood. I could figure out, where my neighborhood was. And in the course of running away from the kids, they were trying to stop me from running away. I thought they were, again, going to beat the hell out of me. I didn't realize that they were just trying to stop me. I ran across the street, and this poor devil driving his car, minding his own business on Hudson Avenue. I remember the street. The car hit me. And I remember going up in the air, coming down, and my head going straight through the guy's windshield. I broke his windshield. My head was inside the car. And still remember his face. He was absolutely scared out of his mind. But not as scared as I was, because now not only did I lose an American ball, but now I broke somebody's car. That was my frame of mind. And so I decided that the idea of escape was still a good one, were I not thwarted by this American car that hit me. And so I extracted myself from the broken windshield and decided that I should continue to be on the run until the end, whatever the hell the end was. So I wound up in this a factory that basically cut long planks of wood. And they had wood all over the place, and I decided the best place for me to hide would be in one of the wood piles. So I secreted myself in one of the wood piles. And apparently I left a trail of blood, which I didn't realize, bleeding from my head. And the class in Brooklyn was dispatched to try to find me. Because after all, I was one of their own at that point. I didn't know it then, but it turned out I was one of their own. And one of the kids followed the droplets of blood and eventually found me. Police came. I was certain that that was the end of me. I refused to give them my address because, I hardly spoke English, but that's beside the point. Because I knew they would probably arrest my mother and my brother Eddie. So the police got a hold of the ambulance, and they took me to a hospital in Brooklyn. I think it was Brooklyn Hospital, right near Prospect Park, I think. Anyway, they performed some surgery on me. I don't remember what kind. I remember having a huge bump on my head. Eventually, somehow, they figured out who I belonged to. My mother was brought down to the hospital. And I still remember this day the hysterics that took place. So, anyway, so that was my introduction to the American ball called the Pinky. And it was a great game. And anyway, ever since that incident, things went smoothly at the school. Got along well with everybody, and that's pretty much it. Except the moral of the story is, don't get hit by a car. And if you get hit by a car, don't leave a blood trail.